Okay, I'm going to give you an overview of classroom observations, and we're going to go through a detailed 10-step process to conduct observations. One of the things that I want to emphasize is Jose Vasquez, whom you know from TA training, just did almost an hour-and-a-half presentation with our university teaching fellows on the Zen of PowerPoint. And I got converted to this like only 2 weeks ago, but I'm redoing every single presentation that I created, which were often busy, often had lots of clip art, lots of, well, I've kept the cartoons in, but the clip art is definitely out. So in order for you to follow along, if you look at your handouts, you have the slides, but the slides are basically all visual. So, excuse me, what I did is took all the text out. So let me grab a water here. So you've got the text. So you haven't lost anything. So if you want, the rationale behind the Zen of PowerPoint is oftentimes we expect students to be reading slides or having slides read to them, and it's sensory overload often. So the idea behind the Zen of PowerPoint is you get an image that fits your material so that the students can concentrate on what you're saying. And then again, you've got the references if you want them, if you need them, if you need to go back. So that's how it'll work as we go along here. So one of the things I want to emphasize is this was the academy. I mean, literally, this was your average university setting. It was, for years and years, it was out of my face. Don't bother me. Don't visit my classroom. Teaching is what I do secretively behind closed doors. And there was not a lot of openness. And that changed. Basically, an article, a magazine called Change magazine, started promoting the idea of classroom observations maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And they become much more common because, as I've said, people are realizing student evaluations are not enough. They're one data point, but they're a very narrow data point. Students can tell you a lot of things that are worth listening to. They can tell a lot about rapport, about your preparation, and so forth. What they can't tell you is the appropriateness of your material. Is it current? They don't know. Is it at the right level? They might know that. If it's way over their heads, they're going to know. Or if they're bored out of their minds, they might know. But because they aren't experts in your field, having another teacher or another TA come to your classroom can be very, very helpful for you. So teaching is a lifelong art, and that's the rationale behind classroom observations. The fact is we never get there. And so it involves continuous learning, not just for the students, but for the teacher as well. So I'm learning. I mean, 2 weeks ago I learned about the Zen of PowerPoint, and man, I have done nothing but stick my head over a computer ever since, capturing images. In fact, I've got some computer geeks coming out to the house today because the downside of downloading too much is you can get viruses, and I think that's what's happened. But that's hopefully something that's easily fixed. The quality of education has become a crucial concern, far more than it used to be. Some of you heard me mention at TA training when I was a TA years ago at Florida State. The operative model was flunk 'em, flunk 'em, flunk 'em. You know, we have standards, we have standards. But now, of course, there's much, much more concern about making institutions accountable to students and having students succeed. So that means our role has changed. We're in a helping role rather than a flunk 'em, flunk 'em, flunk 'em role. A number of scholars believe that pure observation In other words, having someone who is another faculty member or another TA visit your class is essential if you're interested in instructional improvement. And hopefully all of you are. All of you want to teach better. The effective classroom observations involve a 3-step process, and I'm going to talk about each one of those. A pre-conference visit, the observation itself, and then a post-conference visit, or sometimes called a brief or a debrief. Okay, we're going to go through the 10 steps. The first, they aren't really steps, they're things to remember. The first one is that classroom observations, regardless of their purpose, whether they're done by your chair, if you're a faculty member, or whether they're done by a peer, a friend of yours coming to observe the class and let you know how she thinks you're doing, maybe giving you some pointers, encouraging what you're doing right. They should always be positive. There's no reason why a chair can't, come to your class and make that a positive experience for you. So you want to always keep that in mind. When you're visiting other TAs, put them at rest. When you're interacting with a faculty member, again, there should be a collegial exchange, a collegial conversation. In an ideal world, you have cartoons like this where you're positive. In fact, I used to show this to new faculty at new faculty orientation and remind them that they were going to love this place no matter what the working conditions were. I'm not sure they always agreed with me necessarily, but it was certainly a beginning. So the next point to remember about classroom observations is they should be part of a process. In other words, it's a 3-step process anyway, but you can repeat an observation, particularly if it's a fellow TA. You don't have to necessarily do a write-up the second time. If they just want you to come by and say, well, I'm trying some active learning. I'm going to try to do a Thinkpair Share and a roundtable next week. Could you stop by and let me know how you think it went or how I might improve that? So think of it as an ongoing process. And again, you're going to put these data points with other pieces of evidence. So we're never there yet. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? No. Take advantage of training opportunities. That's what today is all about. Training doesn't have to go on and on and on. I mean, I have done all-day workshops on observations where we actually do role plays and practice giving feedback and so forth. In fact, I'm happy to say, how many of you have been in the Middle East? Some of you may have lived in the Middle East. Oh, interesting. Well, because I was invited to do classroom observation workshops in Qatar in the Middle East. It was just fascinating. So you never know. When you invest in a skill or a talent, you never know how it's going to pay off. I sure wouldn't have picked on that. But be sure you do help your faculty members, help your fellow TAs understand this process. Very few faculty members are trained in doing observations, and even fewer chairs are trained. So you'll have some expertise that you can bring to a department that you may not find there otherwise. So we also think of training as brain aerobics. The more you do it, the better at it you get. The reciprocal consultation is probably one of the strongest ways to do observations. There's some seats over here in this corner, if you can get there. Or if people were kind, they might even move over for you. All right. Reciprocal consultations mean that you and a friend just decide, hey, let's visit each other's classes. You can give them written feedback if they want something for a teaching portfolio. And I've got examples in your packet of some written examples. Or you can simply make it oral. Just have your meeting and talk about it. But reciprocal observations are much less threatening because you get to know each other, and it's not as though a chair is coming in a position of power, making judgments about you. Much more positive usually. So now we'll do a little bit of interaction here. What qualities would you look for in a classroom observer? So let me have you think for a minute. Probably not these faces. You probably want a more cheerful, positive classroom observer. Think for about 30 seconds. Okay, let me have you share, please. What are some qualities either you or your partner talked about you'd like to see? Uh-huh.
You talked about looking at the students as well as an instructor to see how the students are reacting, if they're paying attention, if they're taking notes. There's probably some interaction going on that is positive. Otherwise, you got to worry about if they're getting their material across.
Okay. So in other words, to translate that into a characteristic, you'd want a person knowledgeable about observations, because the observation isn't all about you. It involves your impact on students and if students actually are learning. So good point. What else?
Somebody that's honest, like, and that it's not just going to say, oh, everything was great. You want some feedback.
Yeah, honest feedback and constructive feedback. And telling you, oh, you were just great, loved it, isn't going to help. What else?
And you can pay attention to details.
Mm-hmm. It's really important, and we're going to look at some observation samples before we go. You'll see they're very detailed. Overheard this group talking about some interesting things. Can one of you contribute?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we kind of paralleling on the interaction, having an observer be able to participate in activities that you're doing, so that way they can get a really in-depth opportunity to engage in the class and then have a better better feedback and better responses they can give you to your leader.
Yeah. Could everyone hear participation? I think that's an excellent idea. And when I've been visiting classes, typically English classes, for example, because that's my field, I've had the faculty member ask if I would sit in on groups and help facilitate. And that gives me a really good idea of how well they understand things, how constructively they give feedback. But it's something I'm going to bring up in a minute. You want to discuss ahead of time that that's okay. Because some people may not want the visitor participating. I personally would, but good idea. Anything else? Okay, I'll give you some of mine. I would like visitors who can solve problems and help me solve problems, getting a good perspective on it. I want someone who's going to be good at diagnosing issues. If, for example, I identify a problem, maybe I've got a clique in the back who talk all the time, I want that person to be able to help me solve those problems. I want people also that are going to give me good advice. The cape, Larry, go for the cape. It's not really good advice. I want people that will not act like those pictures I showed you earlier, yell at each other. I want constructive feedback. I don't want in-your-face feedback. So it's important that you think seriously, especially with reciprocal consultations, that who you're going to exchange with. Is this somebody who shares similar values, for example? Hopefully you're not totally similar teaching styles, because you'll be stretched and you'll get new ideas if you're seeing different ways of going about it. Another thing to consider is be sure to let the students know that you have a visitor coming. And what I suggest that they do, and what I like to happen to me is that I'm actually introduced to the students. The students are told the class period before that the visitor is coming and why, And you can keep it short. I've invited Barbara to my class so she can give me some pointers. Would you please welcome her, share your books and your notes with her so she'll feel part of the class. She and I discussed her participating, so please, if you're doing any group work, be sure she's welcomed into your group. In other words, the students are part of it. And they should be, because say a class this size, they're going to notice somebody coming in who's a stranger. And you know, you can imagine the rumors, oh my gosh, that faculty member's in trouble. Look, there's somebody checking up on them. And students really appreciate it. When I was at University of Maryland, University College, I had about over 100 peer visitors who were trained to go into classrooms. And University of Maryland, University College is an unusual organization in that virtually all the faculty are adjuncts. So there's a huge turnover. And so what we did, we called this the peer visit program, is I had a computer program that matched all the new faculty, what they were teaching, where they were teaching, what time they were teaching, and then I would match them with different visitors who'd indicated, I only want to visit math classes, or I only want to visit in the social sciences and at Shady Grove in the evenings on Mondays and Thursdays. So it was a great program, and I'm mentioning this in context of students because it was a great public relations thing for the university, because students loved the fact that we cared enough about their teaching to connect adjuncts with other adjuncts, to actually have someone sit in on the class. It was viewed by students as a very positive thing. So make sure they're part of that process as well. And this is the cartoon. Students have opinions. Mrs. Gaffney is a cartilage brain, so that isn't a particularly positive opinion, but they're going to have them. Okay, let's do a Thinkpair Share. Again, turn to your partner, and what are some topics or issues you should discuss beforehand with the teacher or a TA you'll visit? Okay. Topics or issues? I overheard one group talking also about the role the person will play. You know, we alluded to that earlier, but I think that's really important, because I've had some real surprises. I remember one time I was visiting an English class, and all of a sudden the instructor says, well, that's a very arcane grammar question. Let's ask Dr. Millis, our visitor, you know, and a pencil flies into the air, you know, just, we had, when I taught overseas with University of Maryland in Asia, we had a visitor come to Korea where my husband and I were teaching. Well, Pete came totally jet lagged. So the first night he visits my husband's government class, falls asleep in the back. Not what one expects of a visitor. The next night he'd gotten some sleep evidently and visited my English class, and we were in the middle of a discussion of Charlotte's Web, okay, because it was children's lit class. All of a sudden Pete chimes right in and says, well, I never liked that book because I don't like spiders. I'm going, where is that coming from? And did I really want that? No, I didn't. Comments like that. So lots of things you want to talk about. You fit on some of them, the overall objectives for the course, and then the immediate objectives for that class to be visited. I like as much context as I can get. You know, where is this in the semester? What are your students like? You know, and what are some issues, some things you particularly want me to look at? Some other key discussion topics. Talk about whether you're going to give written or oral feedback. And if it is written, what kind of instrument are you going to use? And again, we've got some samples you can take a look at. You already hit on the teaching components, the role the visitor will play. This one's really important, the degree to which student input is encouraged. Students, you will have told the students that a visitor's coming, and sometimes they want to share usually good things, you know, about the class. And But I've been in some really awkward situations. I was visiting a classroom when I was the English coordinator in Asia of it was a comp class. The man teaching it was a philosopher. He may have been a very good philosopher, but he didn't have a clue how to teach composition. And it was so obvious to me from the get-go because he was supposedly giving feedback, and his way of doing it was to say, well, let's see, I know there were some good introductions. Let me read you one. Oh, here it is. It was excruciating, you know, and he kept that up for almost 20 minutes. You know, here's some good transitions, let me find them, going through the whole thing. It was awful. So during the break, this was a 3-hour class, I and the other students headed for the ladies' room, at least the females. Anyway, it was like a mob scene, you know, and this was really awkward because, you know, I'm trying to be professional, but, you know, it's like, you know, they're you know, totally up in arms, and I'm trying to say, well, I think the appropriate person is the area director, flush. And when I got out, the other half of the class was there with pitchforks and up in arms and so forth. Very, very awkward situation. And so the reason then you want to talk to the faculty members, do you mind if students share things with me? And as I said, usually they're positive things. I've had faculty say, oh, please, you know, in fact, could you come about 10 minutes early? I often have students there early and just kind of talk with them informally. That would be great, but others may not want student input. So if you know ahead of time, you can say something to the student that's volunteering information. Say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but Professor X and I talked about the fact that this should be an objective observation, so I'd like to kind of go in and form my own opinions. But please be sure that you give feedback to your professor, or be sure you fill out that online student evaluation. You might win an iPod or iPad. But again, you need to be ready for those questions, so it's good to talk about it. And then finally, the procedures for sharing feedback are important. Again, written or oral, how soon. What I try to do when I leave a class, because sometimes I'll leave at the break, if I can, I'll thank them, you know, and tell them I really enjoyed it, and I will be back in touch with you tomorrow. Make it as fast as you can. Oh my gosh, I have procrastinated, and when your notes get cold, it takes you twice as long to do a written one in particular. So talk to them while it's still fresh. And what I try to do is I'll crank out a draft, and then I'll share it with them with the idea that this is a draft, that I may have misinterpreted something, and you know, if after we've had our conversation, I'll sometimes put the conversation in the final report. I wasn't sure about why Professor X polled his students midway through, but after we discussed it, I realized his rationale. He was intending to do yada, yada, yada. That's fine, because otherwise, if you just do it cold, you could misinterpret. You know, that poll was a total waste of time. Well, if you know why the faculty member is doing it, it may not be, probably isn't. So procedures for sharing feedback, I think, are real important. When I do an observation, I do it holistically. I'm not getting ahead of my slides here. I also recommend that you view the course syllabus ahead of time, because that gives you a context and other relevant course materials. If an exam is important, if, for example, a student's faculty members or a TA is going over an exam, then you probably want to take a look at it. You may want to know what was your percentage of A's, B's, C's, D's, and so forth. You know, whatever's going to help you when you actually go to that class. The bottom line should be no surprises. Take me to your leader, I said, and then the most hideous thing happened. You don't want surprises like that. I try to capture holistically what occurs in the classroom, and by that I mean I literally bring in a legal yellow tablet or something the equivalent, and I take notes as though I'm a student, you know, as detailed as I could possibly make them. But then in the margins, I'll make notes to myself, like students seemed confused, and I know exactly at the point. No one laughed at the joke, and I know what the joke is, okay? It's really good to have that much detail in your notes, because then if you're using a form, and I'll show you a couple of examples of an instrument, it's easy to pull your examples. If you want to focus on rapport, you've got lots of notes, and you've got lots of places where you can pull examples of good rapport. So very, very detailed. And I don't give those notes to the faculty member, but when we're meeting face-to-face, typically I'll have that tablet with me so I can reference, you know, the specifics. And I'm going to really encourage you to be totally and completely specific. You can see the contrast here in the two classes. You can't read this, but I don't expect you to. But I just wanted to show you how detailed these observations can be. And you've got examples we'll look at before we leave in your handout packet. But I like what I call focused observation instruments, where you've got knowledge of the subject and discipline as a broad category, and then you plug in the evidence that this person really knows his or her stuff. Another category might be course preparation and organization. And again, you look at what shows they're well organized, that they're well prepared. Those yellow tablets are filled with notes. I mean, when I did that Fairy Queen observation, I had, I think it was 8 to 10 pages of notes. A lot. But, you know, I'm sitting there anyway. I might as well be writing it down. The more the better, in my humble opinion. Another point is any classroom observation must reflect well thought out teaching criteria. So a focused narrative instrument, again, works really well for me. So one we used at University of Maryland, University College in that peer visit program I mentioned, and then we'll take a look at the ones that we're using here. Information about the class is important in any instrument. So who's the faculty member, what's the time of day, what's the topic, the length of the visit is important. I actually had a visitor in the peer visit program go on a field trip. He said it was the most fun thing he'd ever done. It was a field trip to Gettysburg with the history professor. He said it was just an incredible learning experience for him. But that's not the norm. Usually the norm would be about an hour. Or if it's an hour and 15-minute class, you'd stay the full time. If it's a 3-hour class, we ask faculty to leave at the break, but not to be disruptive. So that's something you can discuss ahead of time with the faculty member, how long you're going to stay. The place is important. Is this an auditorium? Is it a room like this with a lot of densely packed chairs? I think the context, I've taught in some really horrible settings. When I was at Misawa, Japan, teaching comp at an 8 o'clock class, I was next to a shift workers bar, and it was very weird. 8 in the morning, you know, the radio's blasting, the glasses are clinking, and it's a big party going on next door. 8 o'clock in the morning, we weren't ready to join in. I think it might be useful to look at the number of students present versus the number of students registered. If it's a 300-person class and you've got 60 students, that's probably not a good sign. Another thing you can look at is the style of the presentation. And again, we deliberately keep it broad. So style of presentation could be lecture, demonstration, It allows you to describe laboratories, for example. It doesn't straitjacket you. So many observation instruments I've seen imply lecture. And that can hurt people who are doing group work, simply because the instrument doesn't allow an opportunity for a good description. That's why you want to talk ahead of time about what instrument you'll use. You're going to look at things in the presentation like eye contact, gestures, smiling, voice, pitch, tone, a lot of different things. Almost all instruments look at instructor-student rapport. That means how well the students seem to be getting along with the professor. Are they comfortable? Are they willing to speak up? And again, lots of ways to measure that. You could look at questioning techniques, for example, how they lead the class discussions, their openness to suggestions or ideas. We've already talked about the syllabus, and in this particular instrument we actually had a place where they could comment on the syllabus. You know, how well organized was it, how clear. And then I usually end every instrument I've ever developed with open comments, just kind of a general summary, which kind of lets me pull it all together. So that's one particular type of instrument. The feedback, and some of you mentioned this during our earlier discussion, should be accurate. In other words, I was there, I was in that class. So I tell our teaching fellows, and by the way, invite a teaching fellow to your class if you just want some good feedback. They're very happy to come in and observe. But I tell them to go in like scientists, you know, where they're not interpreting, they're not making judgments, they're basically recording what they see as a scientist would. In ethnography, if there are any. Got anthropologists in the room? Anyone from anthropology? Okay, well, anyway, very objective. You mentioned honest in terms of the characteristics of the observer. I think that's important. I use the term concrete, and by that I mean specific, really specific. And I'll give you an example in a minute. It should also be focused on the observation instrument. Think carefully when you're putting things in writing. As soon as it goes into writing, it's a public document. The person is likely to put it in their teaching portfolio, or they might use it for a job interview. So you can say things, you can report the same information, but make it positive or negative. And I used to teach this in composition when we do letters of complaint. You could start in responding to a complaint. You could phrase your wording thusly. We are so sorry to hear of the horrendous experience you had with our defective product. Anyway, those are all negative words. It's just setting it up. So you turn it around, you say the same thing, basically. Thank you so much for contacting us about your experiences with our product. We are always happy to hear from consumers. So you're using words like happy, you know, positive words, but you're still doing the same thing. You're not changing it. So think carefully. Try to get somebody else maybe to read it. We all know from emails that we wish we could take back, that sometimes, you know, our words are misinterpreted and we don't intend them the way other people see them. So the more people who can read it, the better. And then finally make them action-oriented. And by that I mean the purpose of a visit should be to help someone think about changing their teaching. So phrase it positively in terms of doing something positively. Here's an example. This is a very empty sentence, okay? It's a judgment. Excellent rapport exists. What does that mean? How do we know? What is the evidence? So you would take an abstract sentence like that, and then you start plugging in all those specifics. So an example I wrote, your excellent rapport exists. Your students seem to feel comfortable with you and with each other. Before class, 4 students crowded around your desk to share articles they'd clipped from the paper. During the initial class discussion, over half the people in the room contributed ideas. Notice these are facts, but they're evidence, they're support. Throughout the lecture, students were nodding and smiling. 4 students sitting near me planned out-of-class study sessions. 18 polished apples were neatly aligned on your desk. Okay, there's your proof. And it has to come from the specifics. And you won't have those specifics unless you've used the yellow tablet or some equivalent. Some of you who are good at typing could bring an iPad or a laptop. I'm not that good. But again, very specific, very focused, very concrete. Action-oriented would be something like this. Your diagram could not be seen clearly from the back of the room. All right, that's the fact, right? That's the scientist observing. I was in the back, I couldn't see it. Then the action. Perhaps you could consider a larger drawing, an overhead projector, or handouts. So again, you're not telling them do this, do handouts. Perhaps you could consider giving them 3 action options. One of the things in terms of location, when I'm doing an observation, I don't like to sit in the back of the room. And the reason is I'm just seeing the back of people's heads. I can't, see what students are doing. I can't see if they're smiling. I can't see much. I mean, I may be seeing pornography or something extreme, but I can see that from 3/4 of the way in. So typically that's where I'll sit. And again, because the students know I'm coming, I'll sit next to a student or a group of students and say, if you don't mind, could I look over your notes as we're going, and if we're using the textbook, would you mind if I shared it with you? And they're happy to do that. I mean, especially here, students are the nicest I've seen any place. I love the students here. Okay, and then ownership should belong to the faculty member, and by that I mean, if you remember your micro-teaching, the fellows were trying to do this with you. They were letting you analyze. The first thing they typically ask you is, well, how do you think it went? What would you do differently? You get the faculty member or the TA talking about it. Don't just go in there with, you should have done this, you should have done that. Because they're much more likely to change if they've come up with the rationale for the change and the actual things they want to change. One of the things I strongly recommend, oh yeah, here's the cartoon, sorry. You can't push this stuff down people's throats. They'll just cough it right back up. One of the things you want to do is be certain that you record any teaching improvement activities, at least if you're using a written form. And the reason is you'll forget. It's like if you let your notes get cold. So what we used at University of Maryland, University College, was the faculty member and I would sit down and we'd come up with some changes. What do you want to do? What's your timetable for it? How did it go? If they want to add more active learning, they might have a timetable, 2 Thinkpair Shares, 3 round tables by midterm, and then comments on how it went. But I remember one time I was had observed a 3-hour class, and I don't like interstates, so I was actually driving home in a car with the faculty member driving when we had our feedback discussion. Well, it was dark. I didn't take notes. I remember he came up with 5 things he was going to do. I went to sleep. It was after 10 when I got back. I woke up the next morning. I could remember 3. He could remember 1 more. 1 was lost forever because we didn't write it down. So strongly, it doesn't have to be a formal form like this, but consider writing it down. Whoops, I was futzing with this earlier and I accidentally moved it off the page. Integrate data with other teaching data. In other words, don't look at the visit. It's only a snapshot when you're doing a visit. but look at it in the context of the student evaluations, for example, or the context of the review of material that you did. So it shouldn't be just a standalone. Positive feedback. One of the things that we encourage you to do is follow-up visits. And when you're giving feedback, remember that you have two goals. Reinforce the positive behavior. It's real easy for us to be critical, but what you want to do is reinforce positive behavior and then help the faculty member or the TA focus on some changes to make. You know, what would you change if you could? And functions of feedback. I was at the Air Force Academy for 9 years, and I went to a session by a lieutenant colonel that was on performance appraisal, but I was sitting there and I said, by golly, what he's saying is perfect for classroom observations. So your functions of feedback are to provide a source of information, that's you as the scientist observing, about the behavior, about goals, impact on students. The second piece is to provide a source of motivation. Help that person leave your discussion with the energy to improve performance, the motivation to improve performance. Help them understand the value of making those changes and believe they can do it. So they're actually very, very similar in terms of the two main goals. So look at the feedback, and then we don't do videotaping here. We could probably if it were useful. But at Air Force, what I would do is partner with another faculty development person. And Ken and I would go to a class together. I would have my yellow tablet sitting 3/4 of the way in, taking notes. And he would be in front of the room with two cameras. One camera focused on usually it was a lecturer, I hate to say it, on the lecturer, and one camera focused on the students. And then we would give the videotape, in this case we'd use a digital camera, so we'd give the film to the faculty members so they could look at it at home. And then we would look at it together, and then we'd meet with the faculty member. But we wouldn't just sit there and replay the whole thing. That would be a total waste of time. But we could reference it. For example, if he'd wanted feedback on distracting mannerisms, we could zoom in immediately because my notes would tell us exactly where there was a distracting mannerism, so we could key that to the video, and then we'd say, here, let's just watch a couple of minutes here where you're jangling your change in your pockets, and you can just see the students cringing on the front row. You know, let's look at that brief clip. But we never ever sat through the whole thing, just staring at it. So bottom line, teaching is an art, not a science. Every artist needs a grounding in technique before setting to work, and there's no artist or teacher who can't improve his or her skill. So that really is the point of classroom observations. So a quick cartoon finale, and then we'll throw it open to questions. Don't hate change. Make sure the TAs and the faculty members you're working with are open to change, and they're willing to listen and have a dialogue with you. Be sure you fill out that observation instrument if you're going to use a written one quickly, immediately afterwards while it's still fresh. Otherwise, you're just going to it'll take you twice as long. So the bottom line is you and the person you visited will go galloping off into the sunset. So that is the formal end. Thank you all.